Hello, my name is Nicole McLaughlin. I'm a health and safety specialist with WorkSafe NB, and I'll be talking to you today about some occupational health and safety updates, harmonization of standards. In this presentation, I'll present why these changes took place, what harmonization is, how select PPE standards and first aid kits are affected, what these changes mean for you, and I'll also direct you to some tools and resources. Before we get started, I'd just like to point out some of the resources on our website right away. So if you go to WorkSafe NB's homepage, you will find there's a tab that's called Safety Topics. If you click on that tab and enter Harmonization, you will get a page of information, and we will continue to put information on this page as we get information and as people ask us questions. We will add them to our frequently asked questions on that page. So I just want to show you what that page looks like right away, and so this can be used when after this presentation today. So we have information on exactly what personal protective equipment was affected by the change. And so you can click on any of those topics and you will get more information. Also, you'll see here that there is a link so that you can view the standards, the CSA standards that I'll be talking about. You can view them for free, or you can print them, but there will be a cost to that. So you just need to create an account in the CSA on the CSA website. Now, if you scroll down that page, you will see that there is also information on first aid kits. So we're going to talk about that later on in the presentation. And you can see, again, we are referring to the CSA standards again, so you have a link to that site. And here are the frequently asked questions. So questions that people ask us, they may be found on this site. And at the very bottom of the page, there are some resources, and these resources can be very helpful for you. The one resource that I want to take more time and talk about right now is the PPE comparison table. So my information, the information that I will be presenting today, is all found in this table. So you can find what the old requirements were, what the personal protective equipment we were asking for before in the general regulation, and compare it to the new requirements and what the notable changes are. So I'll be basically summarizing the information that is found in this table. The table is about 4 pages long, and my presentation will follow the same order in which the information is laid out. So the first question you might have is why these changes? Why have we decided to harmonize standards? So each of the Canadian provinces has jurisdiction on occupational health and safety. So that means that each province has different requirements. And this can make it fairly complicated when someone is working in different provinces. So what might be permitted in, as a standard in one province isn't necessarily the same standard elsewhere. So the idea is to try to have some kind of harmonization of certain standards, including occupational health and safety in different provinces and territories. And so that will make it easier for people to work in those different provinces. Therefore, federal and provincial ministers from across Canada agreed to harmonize important occupational health and safety standards in order to simplify regulatory requirements for organizations working across multiple jurisdictions without compromising health and safety protection for workers. And thus, on July 9th, 2019, New Brunswick signed the Reconciliation and Cooperation Table Agreement, which led to changes in the occupational health and safety legislation for personal protective equipment and first aid kits. And so the changes have affected certain PPE of the general regulations. The standards that have been affected by the harmonization change are eye and face protection, head protection, foot protection, hearing protection, life jackets and personal flotation devices, and first aid kits. These changes took place at the end of May 2020. What the government of New Brunswick has done, in some cases, has updated the standards, so we are now referring to the same but a more recent version of the standard, and in other cases, we are now referring to a different standard. WorkSafe NB is permitting the old PPE to be gradually phased out through replacement. As long as the PPE is maintained in good condition, you can continue to use it. But when it's time to replace, you will need to replace with a new PPE that meets the current standards that are referred to in regulation. You will also note that all the PPE standard sections have an equivalency clause. This allows employers to do their research and adopt equipment offering better than or equivalent protection without needing to apply for a deviation. They must be able to provide proof to an officer, if questioned, about how the alternate equipment is equivalent. The first standard that I'm going to talk to you about today is head protection standard, which is situated in section 40 of the General Regulation 91-191. We can see what has changed is what is underlined. So we are now referring to CSA Z94.1-15 Industrial Protective Headwear Performance Selection Care and Use. This replaces the ANSI standard Z89.1-1997, which is an American standard. We can also see that this standard, through the title, is more than a design standard because we're also talking about how to care for the head protection and how to use it properly. What it states in the general regulation under section 40, subsection 1, is that for project sites, type 1 class E is the default type of head protection. Type 1 means that it protects the user against impact to and penetration of the crown. Class E is non-conducting up to 20,000 volts. For other places of employment, as described in section 40, subsection 2, they must conduct a hazard assessment to determine the most appropriate type of protective headwear to be worn. An example of a hazard assessment tool will be found on our website in the near future if you don't already see it there. Other elements that are explained in the standard are the use and care of headwear. Protective headwear must be worn facing forward unless it is specified in the manufacturer's guidelines that it can be worn facing backwards. Nothing must be carried inside the headwear. No alteration of the headwear, including drilling holes, will be made. You are not permitted to mismatch components from different manufacturers. You must not paint the headwear unless the paint is approved by the manufacturer. And the headwear is not to be stored in direct sunlight, as we know it affects the integrity of the personal protective equipment. It must be compatible with other PPE if you are wearing a respirator or eye and face protection or hearing protection. The PPE must not compromise the level of protection from the headwear, and it must not displace the headwear. As for fitting, the headwear shall be fit securely and comfortably. It shouldn't fall from the head when the user leans forward and unlikely to shift position when the user's head is turned from side to side. When it comes to inspection, you must review the manufacturer's specifications. The standard also offers directions on how to inspect headwear. The next protective equipment that I want to talk to you about is the eye and face protection, which is section 39 of the regulation 91-191. And what you have here on the slide is the full paragraph of what it says in that section. And again, you can see what has been underlined is what has changed. So it's the CSA Z94.3-15, eye and face protectors. We used to refer to the 1992 standard, and it was called industrial eye and face protectors. So now you can see that it has changed, the title has changed a little bit, but the standard is mostly a design standard. It's very technical in nature. And the types of hazards has been expanded to include lasers, electric arc flashes. It requires Class 1 spectacles or Class 2 protectors goggles to be used with a welding helmet. It refers to the CSA Z94.3.1 guideline for selection, use, and care of eye and face protectors. And the side shields for safety glasses and prescription safety glasses needs to be integrated or permanently attached to the frame. However, as I mentioned before, with PPE, we are allowing people to phase out their use of the old protective equipment. So even though you may have, right now, you may have safety glasses or prescription safety glasses where the side shields are not permanently attached, it's still okay, it was still acceptable as long as they are in good condition. However, when you do need to get it replaced, then you will need to replace with the correct standards, with the most current standards. The next section that I'm going to present is hearing protective equipment, which is a section 48 of the General Regulation 91-191. And what it says now is that the employer shall ensure that hearing protective equipment conforms to the CSA standard CSA Z94.2-14, hearing protection devices performance selection, care, and use. And this replaces the CSA standard Z94.2-94 hearing protectors. So again, you can see that we're not only talking about the design of the hearing protection, but we're also talking about, okay, well, how are we selecting it? How are we caring for it? How are we going to use this? Because not only is it important for a personal protective equipment, especially something like hearing protection, to be selected, to be the proper selection, but it also must be worn properly to give you the proper protection. So what it specifically states in the CSA standard is that the employer needs to ensure that they have a fit training program. So they need to demonstrate how to properly wear to fit these protection devices. And this fit training needs to be done one-on-one. It can't be a group setting because we need to supervise closely to make sure that as we're demonstrating, the person is able to see us, demonstrate how to fit these properly, and we also need to watch the employee put them in. So we really need to be able to pay close attention. The user needs to appreciate the feel of a proper seal. I have seen many times where people do not take the time to put the protection in properly, and they just kind of stick the hearing protection in their ears, and they move on. So they are certainly not getting that proper seal, and it's not going to give them the proper protection. So they need to appreciate the feel of a proper seal, and also they need to ensure that their hair, the jewelry, or their clothing is not being worn in such a way that could interfere with the seal of the earmuffs. Employees who wear hearing protection devices need to receive training at regular intervals. And what regular intervals is considered is once every 2 years. The issuing and the use of devices, there's a selection table that will help you determine, okay, what would be the best hearing protection in our case, in our situation, and that will help you comply with Section 32 of our General Regulation 91-191. The next personal protective equipment I'm going to talk to you about is foot protection, which is outlined in Section 41 of the General Regulation 91-191. We are now referring to the CSA Z195-14 Protective Footwear Standard. This replaces the CAN CSA Z195 M92 Protective Footwear Standard. It remains a design standard. What has the big change, what has changed here is protection to exposure from chainsaw or other cutting tools. And so what you will see is that this footwear will have a fir tree on it. So that really shows that it has protection to exposure from the chainsaws. And also there's some guidance on selecting sole material that will minimize slipping. The last personal protective equipment that I'm going to talk to you about today is life jackets and personal flotation devices. If you look under Section 51, subsection 2 of the General Regulation, it states that if an employee is exposed to risk of drowning, that the employer must ensure that the employee uses a life jacket, a personal flotation device, or automatically inflatable personal flotation device, approved by Transport Canada or an agency permitted by Transport Canada to approve it. So what you're looking for when you are choosing a life jacket or personal flotation device is the label. On the label, you need to see that it states Transport Canada approved and the approval number. So you can see an example of that on the picture on the slide where you can see the red arrow. This replaces two references to the CGSB, which is the Canadian General Standards Board, and reference to UL Standards, which is the Underwriters Laboratory. So there are 3 Canadian approved types of life jackets. There's the Safety of Life at Sea life jackets, which meet high performance standards and are appropriate for all vessels. There's the standard type life jacket, which are approved for all vessels except commercial vessels, and the small vessel life jackets, which are approved for small vessels. The life jacket, what is different with the life jacket compared to a personal flotation device is that a life jacket will turn an unconscious person from face down to face up in the water. So that would be a consideration when you're trying to determine, okay, what do we want? Do we want life jackets or do we want PFDs? Now, a personal flotation device, they come in many types, sizes, and colors, and they may be a vest type, they may be a pouch type. You can see that they're much less bulky, and so you might have to manually inflate it blow air into it, or perhaps they will inflate themselves when they touch the water. Another thing to consider when you're trying to determine, okay, do we have personal flotation devices or do we have people wear life jackets, is also Section 51.4 of the General Regulation. It states that employees must wear a life jacket when they are working alone or the workplace cannot provide quick and effective rescue. So in those cases, you will not have a choice but to wear a life jacket. So those are the changes to the personal protective equipment. The next change that I want to talk about is the first aid kit. So this is the Section 11 of the First Aid Regulation 2004-130. So we're no longer talking about the general regulation, but we're talking about the First Aid Regulation. And if you look under Section 11, it now refers to the CSA standard for first aid kits. And it used to refer to the Schedule C. So we had Schedule C at the very end of the first aid regulation, which stated all of the contents that were necessary for a first aid kit. Now we are referring you to the CSA standard. When you look at Schedule A in the first aid regulation, you will see at the bottom it lists the workplaces that are considered high hazard workplaces. So high hazard are activities with a higher likelihood of harm and a greater severity of injury. So if your workplace is a high hazard workplace, then you will need the Type 3 or intermediate kit. Otherwise, the basic kit, Type 2 kit, will be appropriate for you. I would also like to point out that similar to personal protective equipment, there is a phase-in implementation of the new CSA standards. So this means that if a workplace is continuing to replenish its old first aid kit, it will continue to comply with this section of the regulation. But when it's time to purchase new first aid kits, then these new kits must meet the CSA standard. There are a couple of tables on our website that you will find helpful. The first is a first aid kit selection table that will help you select the appropriate first aid kit for your workplace. The next is a first aid kit content table for existing first aid kits. And this is available on our website. I had shown you where to find this information at the beginning of my presentation, and but I hadn't opened up this particular table. So what you can see here is the number of people in the first column, number of employees per shift, and whether the workplace is a place of employment with no high hazard or is a place of employment with high hazard. And depending on the number of people you have per shift, and if you have no high hazard or high hazard, we can see how many first aid kits and first aid providers, as well as if you need a first aid room. So this combines Schedule A, which you will still find at the in the regulation, in the first aid regulation, and the CSA first aid kits. So for example, if I have 20 to 49 employees at my workplace and I am a workplace with no high hazards, so it's people who are working in offices, for example, then I would need to have one first aid kit and one first aid provider. And if I look to this column, now under the CSA first aid kit column, I can see that I would need one CSA Type 2 medium basic kit. However, if I'm working at a place of employment which has high hazards, so perhaps I work in on a construction site, I would need, for 20 to 49 employees, I would need to have 2 first aid kits and 2 first aid providers. And I would need 2 type 3 small intermediate kits. And one thing that you can also note is that we do have equivalency combinations. So if I, for example, perhaps I have a larger workplace, perhaps I have 50 to 99 employees, I have a large workplace, and perhaps instead of having here 2 medium basic kits, perhaps what would work for me better is to have 2 small first aid kits and 1 medium, because we have equivalency combination of kits. So 1 medium CSA first kit is equivalent to 2 small CSA first aid kits. We want first aid kits as much as possible to be as accessible as possible. So you may decide that you want to have more first aid kits in order to make it more accessible to people. This slide presents the first aid kit content table. This information used to be Schedule C and was part of the First Aid Regulation 2004-130. You can continue to replenish your existing first aid kits with the materials presented in this table. However, if you need to purchase new first aid kits, you will be expected to comply with the CSA standards for first aid kit content, choosing from either the personal kit for a person who works alone, basic kit for low hazard work, and intermediate kits for high hazard work, and choosing the most appropriate size, small, medium, large. More information on the contents of the CSA approved first aid kits can be found on the CSA Standards website. So if you have questions you can that are not explained on the safety topic page, you can always send an email to prevention@ws-ts.nb.ca, and someone from my team will be happy to answer your questions.